Caught me. You caught me texting. Good morning. Welcome to CarbonExpo. We're going to kick off this morning with a fireside chat with Kevin Burns of S&P Global. So what we're trying to do here at CarbonExpo is to educate and empower the energy complex, old energy, to become a leader and make profitable businesses in new energy. And one of the key issues that we face in the short term is emissions. And so that's what we're going to talk about this morning from a little bit higher standpoint. So Kevin started his career in economics and political science and policy at a think tank, but then for about the last 12 years, he's been rising up through the ranks at what was IHS Market and is now S&P Global. And of course, that includes Cambridge Energy Research Associates historically. So he's studied in the past oil markets, but now taken that same systems thinking, same analytical approach, and focused that on emissions. And so he's the global head of the Center for Emissions Excellence at S&P Global. And from that platform, a high level in a high organization, he advises companies and governments, regulators, and industry as a thought leader on emissions. And he also happens to be based in sunny Calgary. Good morning, Kevin. How are you?
Good morning. I'm just looking out my window. I don't know if it's sunny quite yet, but good morning.
Yeah, well, it gets a lot colder there than it does here in Fort Worth, but I'm actually a little jealous.
It does. It's not that cold here today. We got a little bit of snow. So if you like skiing, it's a great day.
Well, see, not that cold for you is like freezing anorak weather for me. It's a whole different scale here in Texas.
It's also relative to age.
Well, let's not talk about that. We'll conceal all the gray hairs. So listen, you've been at IHS for a number of years. How long has IHS been studying emissions? I'm sorry, not IHS, S&P Global. It's such a long history of leadership. It's stuck in my head.
And there's so many companies that make up these two organizations and predecessors, right? You name some: Sierra, Pervin and Gertz, Fiquette Associates, and go on through the different lineages. And there's a lot to draw
all good
on.
names.
Yeah. So both organizations prior to the merger last year were really going down this road. And there's different reasons we were doing this. Platts was, looking at the fundamental need to enable carbon differentiated trading. So the embedding of the non-physical attributes, such as the carbon intensity, in the value of commodities. The IHS market side was really dealing with questions coming in from the industrial sectors, industrial emissions or industrial clients. How do I compare? How do I understand my relative competitiveness? Collectively, these two companies have well over a decade doing different types of accounting, carbon accounting, going back into the early mid-2000s. Is really when I started to get into it. And it was really about trying to understand, trying to derive context. If I threw out a number for you, it's meaningless because you don't have any basis of reference. Everybody knows when you go to a gas station what a high gas price is and a low gas price, because we've had experience with emission metrics. It's a whole new ball game, right? Yeah.
Well, I love that concept. I've heard it for a couple of years now. And I really believe it has legs, that commodities will differentiate themselves. There will be better barrels that'll fetch a higher price or have preference in the purchase order, and ones that are not as preferable. And what I heard you say was that people on the purchasing side were asking the questions already about how to purchase better stuff.
Yeah, we've seen, trades in LNG have been the most covered in the media where they're looking at that. We have seen interest in from clients looking at how do they think they may be able to have an advantage because they think their commodity is particularly low carbon, or others, what is the potential risk to this product I sell? And it really depends. Like, gas is nice because it's very homogeneous. Methane is methane is methane. Whereas crude oil, is not homogeneous. It's a fungible commodity, but it yields it, it goes to different refiners of different kit to maximize that barrel, and they yield different product mixes. And so it's also very complicated in sense from the crude oil side. If you build in a carbon intensity into the value, but what's the end use product too? And that affects the value too. So it's a very complicated Rubik's Cube if you think about it on that side.
Well, and that's a good reason to have a dedicated center and a dedicated team to analyze this. It seems like you really taken it to the next level, though, now with a dedicated combined team that you're leading. Well, first, is that right?
Yeah, yes, technically, but the best way to think about what we are is we're a team of 8. We're a highly functional team. And the reason that we were established is we're a complex organization. We have lots of smart people, and they work on many different sectors. You can think about our upstream resources, our midstream, our downstream, petrochemicals, NGLs. We have gas power, climate solutions, renewables, hydrogen practices. And the reason for the center wasn't that we're going to do this stuff for them. We're going to help them. And so when you talk to us and talk to our emission experts, depending on what type of emission you're interested in, you're going to talk to those experts that understand refining about emissions. We're going to work with our refining colleagues to ensure what they build into the refining models they have is consistent with the same stuff they're building into upstream, so we can link these value chains. And so we house our strategic function, and we house our carbon accounting unit, and that carbon accounting unit is a shared service. So I work with many, many people. It makes it very, very complicated for me. But the best way to think about what the center is the center is our commitment to the clients, our clients, that we're taking this seriously, and our intention is to build emissions into all of our offerings as a key performance indicator.
Now that I think is beautiful. Now there have been a lot of people complaining about the pressure from ESG investing. So down here in Texas, our Attorney General has been researching and refusing to do business with anybody who's making decisions on rejecting oil for ESG reasons. But what I hear you saying is not people acting on the basis of fear or threat. It sounds like but I imagine there is some risk for people who lag. But I hear you talking about opportunities, and is that, I guess, is there both? Is there both opportunity and threat?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, I think there is opportunity here, right?
Yeah.
We know that society has decided that we need to get on with energy transition. And we know that means the supply and demand of certain commodities will change. And that means different things for different commodities. There's a lot of discussion of peak oil demand, but there's a lot of discussion about the absolute demand growth required, or supply growth required, for copper, for example, right? It also means that you will see policies around trying to reduce emissions, and that has cost implications. So you have these risks associated with certain commodities that people are trying to understand, right? What could be the future outlook for gasoline or diesel, and how could that impact crude oil? Or what could the potential for future policy mean in terms of impacting my margin? And that's really what investors are trying to understand. So society is pushing for a reduction in emissions. And I think there's a general consensus that, yeah, we're going to do this, right? And certainly in the upstream, we're seeing the companies line up to compete, right? Yeah. But there's also this investor pressure trying to understand what this risk means for these companies, and how these companies plan to be resilient through changes in supply and demand and potential policies around the world. Emission data is really a key metric, or the key metric, to help them understand that. And that's why they're looking for that information. And they're looking for it from companies through corporate disclosure. And they're looking at from third parties like S&P Global, because they want it down to asset level as well. Because, and the reason they want it at asset, and this is, at a corporate level, you can have a lot of things in your portfolio. You could have solar panels and wind turbines, and you can have things that are very carbon intensive, and you balance it out so you get this corporate portfolio. But it's hard for an investor to know where you're actually making your money relative to the carbon intensity. So they're interested in the assets themselves to understand that relative risk of where you're deriving your revenue associated with your emission profile coming from.
Well, let's talk about emissions profile in just a second. But first, I'll tell you a story. I was talking with an operator in confidence a couple of years ago, maybe just a year and a half. And he was facing a investigative journalist who was writing this piece about his company, which was one of the highest emitters in the state. And so he felt it as a threat. But they bought some time. They acted quickly to adjust their operations. They precluded the write-up by becoming one of the lowest emitters of the state. And what he said was they made money on it after they reacted to some pressure and a threat. But in the end, all the gains that they made reducing emissions translated to revenues, and it was actually a money maker. So, and I appreciate that you're looking at this quantitatively and comprehensively, so we don't have to hip shoot and guess. So help me understand, break down, where do our emissions come from?
That's a layered question.
Well, tell me first a little bit about the model you've built. I mean, it goes soup to nuts, right?
Yeah. So let me, not to totally avoid your first question, everybody thinks about an emission as like a number at the end of the day, like it's, 13 kilograms a barrel or 14 kilograms a barrel or whatever the appropriate unit for whatever you're in, right? But the reality is the emissions occur because we're burning fuels, right? That's ultimately, we're using energy, and that process of using energy is going to emit something to the environment. And so that, if we focus in, I'm going to pick on the upstream a little bit. If we focus in, understanding how those operations are using fuels, and they use them differently. If you're in the offshore, it's going to be different than if you're the onshore unconventionals, or you're up in the Canadian oil sands. You're using fuels for different reasons in different ways. And that's what's giving rise to your profile, what your total number looks like. It also then means to understand the potential for decarbonization, you have to understand that fuel use inside those plants. So, to move over to your second question, when we started looking at how do we want to look at and model emissions, we decided that we needed to be as granular as possible. We need to understand how these fuels are being used. So it wasn't just a case that we're going to generate a number. It was a case that we can understand why that number is occurring, what's dominating that number. And then we can also start to begin to understand what's the ease of abatement. Like your example, your friend, I'm assuming their issue was methane, fugitive methane emissions.
It was.
Methane is a marketable product, right? So if you capture that methane, you can market it. It's not always the case that abatement is cash positive for operators. There's a lot of things that cost money. Electrification is going to cost a significant amount of money and take time as well. So anyways, we built these models. The model we have for the US, the North American onshore, I should say, it's Canada, United States. It's over 6 million wells. It's over 5 billion data points. It goes back to the 1940s and goes forward in time to the end of every natural life of every well in operation. Wow. So we can see and start to understand, and it's people want the number, and I get that, and we can talk about some of the numbers, but for us, it's the understanding, it's the why. And then we can start talking about what the real thing is. It's in the number. It's not the number. It's how do we reduce that number and do it cost effectively.
Well said, Kevin. And you've mentioned before something from economics that makes perfect sense. And this is a supply curve of opportunities. Some of the stuff that we'll do to reduce emissions make money. Some of them are really cheap. And then some, ultimately, to get it down to zero, we're going to end up doing some high cost stuff like electrifying a frac fleet. What are the pieces of that puzzle? What are the parts of the emissions that people are working with, and what surprised you?
So you mean in relation to like the opportunities to reduce the emission profiles?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. So if we're going to continue on the theme, it really comes down to your extractive technology. How do you produce what you produce in upstream oil and gas versus another form of extraction? Like we talked about offshores, got very little in common with onshore. Yes, we still drill wells, right? So the offshore, you find things like they're using produced natural gas to generate their energy, and they're re-injecting it. They have a lot of controls because obviously you can't have any leaks on those platforms, right? There's a lot, historically a lot more controls. I should say the onshore is putting in a lot of controls in place on the onshore, you're using diesel to drill wells, and you're using running pumps and stuff like that, right? So you're identifying those opportunities that you have the lowest cost to reduce. So in the onshore, you see a lot of focus on methane, fugitive methane emissions. So you see investments in remote sensing, you see investments in satellite technology. Really police my asset and tell me when you find something, because everybody thinks about fugitive methane emissions as like a constant leak. It's sporadic, it's random. So unless you have someone standing there watching it all the time with a sensor, you're not going to find it. And so they have to put a consistent effort in to do that. And then they can fix that problem, and then they move on to the next one. The other one you see in unconventional, a lot of focus on electrification. If I take that diesel fuel out and plug into a grid, which increasingly in West Texas is increasingly green, you offsetting with a renewable source of energy. If you look in the offshore, they're looking for electrification, but your options to electrify depends on that grid. So you see a lot of electrification projects in the Norwegian offshore. Closer to shore, that grid is hydro dominated, so you get a real good kicker out of it. You don't see the same degree on the UK side. The UK side is further out in the ocean. The grid isn't as green if they were to do a tieback, so the gains of that project are less. Another good consideration when you think about the reasons to decarbonize is the value of the remaining asset. The Norwegian side has a lot of newer, higher productive facilities. You think of the Johan Sverdrup operation, behemoth. It's got a long lead time in it. You're going to be producing there for a while. So it makes a lot of sense to electrify it versus something's mature and decline somewhere else. Would you spend the money to electrify it, or would you just run it out? And so that's the other way to think about that. And then, to pick the third example, which is completely different than the other two, in the Canadian oil sands, they are basically burning natural gas to generate heat. So it's not necessarily readily electrifiable. You're not going to get the same benefit because it's not as efficient to burn something to generate electricity, then take the electricity and generate it back to generate heat. So you see them looking and leaning really hard into carbon capture and storage. These are large industrial plants. And so if I remove the emissions from them, rather than remove the fuel, which the other people are looking at, I can get an abatement opportunity.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think a lot of people believe that the energy transition means windmills, solar panels, and maybe electric vehicles. But those are a small fraction of the overall picture. Efficiency, reducing emissions, and capture have got to be major parts. But there certainly are. There've got to be themes in here, right, Kevin? That this sort of factor drives what's happening. Now, people have assumed for years that the U.S. Was substantially cleaner. Their operations were substantially cleaner than the rest of the world because we're an advanced country. But what have you found to be the drivers, the themes in emissions intensity for hydrocarbon production?
Sure. So there's a bunch of reasons, right, that influence the profile. Certainly the extractive technology itself, how do you actually produce that molecule, matters, right? The operator practices, maybe they have a very robust sensing program in for fugitives and someone else doesn't, right? And then there's abatement opportunities, right? But the other thing that really matters that we find, and we can talk about the differences in emissions as well, which is a fun area. It's fun with numbers, is the rock, the productivity, right? So if we think about emission intensity as a competitive metric, which I actually agree with, a lot of people want to talk about absolute emissions as a competitive metric, but that doesn't correct for scale. So just because I'm bigger, I'm going to emit more, even if my production is more efficient than say you or smaller, right? So emission intensity makes a lot of sense for me.
And by emissions intensity, you mean kilograms per
unit of
kilograms
output
per barrel.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
Okay.
But that's a ratio, right? So it's you said it's kilograms, right. So it's your emissions per some output number. So if I have a massive output number, if I have a super productive asset, guess what? My emission intensity is going to be low.
Yeah.
Right. So
big denominator.
Yeah. So all these factors can influence the numerator, right? Technology, operator practices, even geography can affect it. But productivity has the ability to dominate, absolutely dominate that profile. And so the lesson that we're seeing in almost every play is, first of all, incredible variation, like gobsmacking variation. A lot of the conversations have been about this play looks like this, and this one looks like this, and so this one's better than this. Well, within every play, we all know that the rock quality varies, and so do the emission intensity, and they vary wildly. And it also implies those that have, the geologists get to continue to be right. Those that have the best rocks or the highest productive assets or the highest productive areas are advantaged from carbon intensity point of view right from the get-go.
That's fascinating. You heard the story about the statistician who had his head in the oven and his feet in the freezer, and on average he was just fine.
Yeah, I do that. There's the law of average where the guy goes across the river 3 feet deep on average, it says, and he drowns. Yeah, same thing.
Same thing. But we've used averages for a long time, and most of the research that I've seen up to this point has been on average, and that average is usually at a country scale, right? The US and Canada, Norway, and Saudi Arabia. But you're telling me that the variation within that average is very wide within a country, within a basin, even. Yeah. So we can't even say, well, the Midland Basin average emissions and correctly identify any individual in that.
Yeah, well, it's a collection of individuals ultimately, which is the best way to think about it. And each individual is going to be different, right? You're talking about tens of thousands of wells. If we pick on the Bakken, there's 16,000 wells in there, right? Like I think it's 16,000 are active. I'll have to pull the.
That's about right.
But so in the Williston Basin, we just did a study. We did a comprehensive review of it. I think it was for 2021. We found the average intensity in the Williston at about 25 kilograms per barrel. Okay. But the range ranged from 1 into the multiple hundreds.
Oh my goodness.
Right. So that doesn't discount the importance of the average. That means most of your production in the Williston is in and around 25, right? But you also have extreme outliers. You have wells that are hyper efficient down to 1, right? Which are world scale, world class. I'm sure that operator's high-fiving around, and then you've got ones that are in decline in maturity. Right. And they're older wells and they're in the end of life, and they're probably going to operate till something breaks, and then they'll turn them off. Another example, I'll give you another example. Averages do matter, but the variation really matters too. That's what I'm trying to get to. In the oil sands, right, largely assumed to be the highest carbon assets out there, right? It has an average intensity about 69 kilograms per barrel. Okay. And it ranges from 39 to 127.
So actually there's some Bakken production that has higher intensity than some oil sand production.
Yes. But it's also a volume question. And those tails, all these plays have these tails in them, these higher carbon tails. And it's generally more mature, lower productive assets to sit on the tail. Then the question is, how much volume is there? Right. And so this discussion about distribution curves and averages, we find really, really interesting when we think about competitive dynamics on emissions.
Yeah. So it sounds like the operator, well, first, for just a total range of emissions intensities, the range of possibilities is about 1 to about 100, 150, 90% interval. Globally, order of magnitude across. Somebody says that I have a 10 millidarcy reservoir. I know that's kind of I have a kind of sense for that. If somebody says my intensity is 25 kilograms per barrel, is that on a big picture scale, medium, low, medium? Yeah.
So some Middle Eastern assets are down at around 1, right? North Sea, 1 to 127. Give you an idea, North Sea is probably one of the more attractive regions in terms of carbon intensity on average, right? So there's really good rocks in the Williston too. It averages about 12.
Fascinating.
Right. So you're in the right thing. You have to think distribution, right? You have to think individuals. And so you can have stuff coming out of plays that you look or been labeled poor or bad that's actually quite good for that specific operator, right?
Yeah.
And that's the best way to think about it. So if you think about competing on transition, it's going to be a much more diverse playing field or competitive landscape than we thought about. And we probably should have thought a lot harder about it, because companies are really good at competing, and the quality, the fundamental rules in oil and gas have not changed. Acreage and rock quality really do matter.
Hey, don't, hey, listen, you can't say that because I work with geologists and they'll get a big head. So it sounds like what any particular operator who is facing either threat or opportunity has two knobs to turn, big knobs: numerator, emissions; denominator, production. What break those down for me? What knobs can we turn in? What kind of opportunities are there that a person might have depending on their location and the style of production in the numerator? And we'll talk about the denominator next, because that's probably more complicated,
Yeah, we're also only talking about intensity, right?
right?
So the pressure on operators is not limited to just intensity. But
Ah,
certainly, I would argue that's probably the dominant metric being sought. But the pressure on operators is also in absolute emissions too, right? And so, even if you have the best rocks in the world, maybe you have a ton of production, you have a big footprint still. And so there's still going to be pressure to improve that overall profile, and that's not going to go away. We kind of delved into this earlier. It really depends on your unique profile and you as a company and how you've approached that. I think if we pick on shale, it's methane and methane insurance, right? And it's because one, it's an economic resource. But two, it's something that you could post pretty quick, rapid numbers in terms of improvement. I'd say another area is probably electrification, but that again, this is where geography matters. Where are you? How close are you to the grid? And then how much would it be to connect you, right? And then what's that grid you're backing into too? How clean is it?
that's right. Yeah. And that's an important question. Like you said, Norway is almost entirely hydro. So the emissions in their grid is very small. And Texas is actually a leader
Yeah, it is.
in low carbon emissions, notwithstanding the fact that we do have a portfolio standard for natural gas. Little known fact, Texas law requires half of all new generation be natural gas. What in that, how do those things fall in the supply curve? And where do things like routine about flaring and combustors fit in?
I'm sorry, I don't.
In terms of the numerator of emissions, you talked about reducing fugitive emissions and electrification, assuming that the grid is relatively clean. Well, there are other things that people are talking about: flaring, reducing frac fleets, electrifying frac fleets, and not just operations. Where do those fit in the scale of opportunities?
Yeah, it depends. Again, it depends on the play, right? Certainly the great example is in North Dakota, right? When they brought in the flaring regulations, we saw a very profound shift in the overall profile of the emission intensity of that play. And actually, absolute emissions too were affected by that. So that if you think about it, I think about it in terms of pie charts, what makes up your emissions, right? So flaring can be quite significant as well. Production-related flaring and production-related CH4 emissions can be quite significant for unconventionals. Once you kind of carve those down and you're able to tighten them up, the assets themselves get fairly efficient. And you look at then electrification and other kind of fuel uses. And this is where you really need to start looking. For me, this falls into the upstream emission team, and I usually let them, they go nuts with it. They know this better than me. And I start moving on to another asset and start looking, well, how does unconventional then compare to decarbonization in another part of the world? Is it relatively easy, or what are those opportunities? And I start to think about it that way, rather than digging deeper. We have a team. We have a dedicated team on North American unconventionals based in Houston. We have a dedicated team on international offshore in the UK, and we have teams kind of be sprung up all over the world that are experts in those specific resource classes.
Excellent. Let's come back to that idea in a minute. If an operator wanted to change his denominator, well, first for emissions intensity, the production that comes with a field always declines. After we finish developing, it's all downhill. Maybe a temporary bump for redevelopment, but it's all downhill, which means that if my absolute magnitude of emissions stays the same, my emissions intensity is naturally going to climb, which means that It's my barrels are going to become less advantaged, which also means that the countries and locations with, on average, much lower production rates per well are going to have higher emissions per well. So it would seem natural for someone trying to manage a portfolio emissions intensity to start trading assets.
I think it does. Run room is really important. Yeah, and if you can get your hand on better acreage, it gives you more run room to maintain a low CI. So certainly, access to better acreage, better land can be part of your greenhouse gas strategy in terms of it from a carbon intensity standpoint. It also gives you more run before you move into tertiary areas where you're going to have upward pressure from that denominator, lower productive wells as well. So I think that is important. The other thing to think about is cycle time.
Yeah.
Everybody likes to think of oil and gas as like this homogeneous thing, and we produce X amount per year. And then this is why, we have these conversations about peak oil demand, and everybody's like, oh, it's so scary. Well, no, oil is a wasting asset. As soon as you drill a well, the next thing you got to do is look for the next one, right? And so you have these natural declines, right? So if you think about it, your cycle time matters. So if you think about those mature wells that are low productivity that are further out and that could be put at risk, right, by a higher carbon price or differentiated crude pricing or whatever happens. If they start shutting down earlier and you add up those volume over a large system, it can be significant. Well, that means to keep the system balanced, we need to drill more wells. So you end up speeding up the cycle time and that the pace at which you have to run on the treadmill. And different places have different treadmills, right? Like Shale's a very brisk run right now, right? Like, but versus slow walks in the oil sands, right? But like that cycle time, if you start cutting them, those tails off, you're inevitably thinking about increasing that cycle time. So you need more E&P activity to maintain your production level, but you also can maintain a lower carbon intensity potentially. We haven't done the math on that one. Like there is an equation there that's optimized between those two things. Like, what does that look like?
Well, but there's got to be a way, and probably emissions management's not a single exercise. It's probably not a 1 or 2 year sprint and you're done. It's probably a 1 or 2 year sprint. You get a lot of it done, and then you face headwinds. We
tend to think of it as, from a company point of view, a KPI that's being incorporated into their businesses. It's one KPI. It's not the be all end all of performance indicators. Ultimately, productivity is probably the most important one still. Money matters. These things matter. The reason we spend so much time on emissions, and I am completely biased because I've got emissions in my job title, but the reason we spend so much time on it is we're trying to figure it out. I think once we figure it out, once the market prices it, it just becomes business.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, this is, there was a time when people threw a fit about safety. And now safety is just fully baked in. It's just standard of care. Yeah. There's a time when people in Texas objected to the idea of having to cover pits and line pits. We wanted to put oil and earth in pits. Is this just the next item that we need to take care of and protect along the way? And it'll get baked in. So, and I appreciate the perspective that there's a lot more complexity than generalizations. So many problems are this way. The more you study it, the more interesting, paradoxical, complex it gets. Yeah. It still seems to me that the biggest issue is determination. There's a strategy question, and there's a value determination, heartfelt question. General Patton was reported to say a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. That I tend to agree with that in this case, especially. What do you think? What are the key ingredients for a company that wants to get ahead of this and understand their emissions intensity?
Well, generally, there's almost like a cycle I've seen companies go through. And the first one is to footprint. And what I mean is go through and do the inventory, figure out where your emissions are happening, what's driving them. And most companies have that. And the second one is, how do I improve that? How do I get higher granularity on that? And then that allows you to start identifying opportunities for improvement. We found a lot of improvement in emissions performance can come about through efficiency. So there's economic reasons to tighten things up and investing in it to do that. Then you have to move on and think about larger scale larger scale decarbonization and start planning strategically about how you lay that out. But that first piece, those first two pieces are the most important. Taking that stock, doing the inventory, doing the street, doing the math internally. And increasingly as well, we're seeing the need for certification and verification. So a third party comes in and basically assesses what you're saying to the market. And that's particularly around methane, right? This is about credibility. I've done X, Y, and Z. Someone comes in and says, yes, you did. And so we're seeing that, and we're seeing certified gas contracts being spun up around that. And people are trying to carve out a premium in the market or a place for that molecule from them because they're investing in it. I'd say generally that is something the market is trying, like operators are trying to get their head around, is how do I'm doing the right thing. I'm spending money on sensors. I'm capturing methane. There's some economic value, but it's not free. How do I recoup that investment? So there is the market looking for price signals both ways, both from operators looking for how do I monetize it? How do I invest in material capital expenditures in this without a price in the market in a lot of regions. Other places have carbon prices, so there's an incentive to avoid, but they're trying to make these investment decisions.
Well, it's great that there are the people that far into it. It seems to me that the energy transition now is just about where the internet was in the early 90s. We've got AOL America Online. Did you ever use AOL?
I got the stuff in the mail too. I got the little CD. Yeah. What is it?
What's that?
I was thinking that there was also the CD club or a tape club. I can't remember what that was either.
Oh yeah, no, that was the thing. I don't think we can understand very well what's going to happen long term, other than the world's going to turn upside down. We'll go through generations of things that are important. And in each of those generations of things that are important, we're going to see rapid change, something very dynamic. So I realized when I asked the question, Kevin, that I'm putting you on the spot. What do you see as the future? What's coming down the pipe for the emissions issues?
I think generally we are seeing more policy, both in terms of carrots, which I'd put the IRA in the carrot category, and sticks internationally. I'd say generally the society has basically decided that we're going to price this thing in some way or another, and that's what we see happening. But I also see companies setting up to compete, and I think they're going to compete ferociously. I don't think it's true that the profile of oil and gas of yesterday is going to be the profile tomorrow. I think we're going to see massive improvements from the operators and from ingenuity and technology. So the line of sight for us is the market will price carbon in one way or the other, and the companies are going to get their head around it and they're going to compete on it. That's what we see happening. For us, we see our role as being a third party trying to provide the market the metrics it needs to basically make business decisions that incorporate carbon. So whether that's carbon differentiated trading or understanding asset competitiveness.
Great help, and you can facilitate these changes. How do you think this is going to affect private operators as much as the public? What I heard you say, there was a lot of it was about, I think, more pressure on publics or more issue for publics.
Certainly public companies, I would argue, and I wouldn't say this universally, have been more exposed through the financial markets and through the investors asking these questions and asking for this kind of information. You can think of disclosure, right? We've had increasing requests for non-financial disclosure. Emission intensity has been one of those high areas of interest. And the companies have responded, increased the level of disclosure, and it's almost become table stakes in terms of providing that information. So I think the private companies haven't been exposed to the same degree, and I don't say that's universally true, but we are seeing that. I'd expect that exposure to increase, and I would expect them to report as well on disclosure over time, but it won't be the same way. It'll be to those private investors.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I have started to hear talk about that. Individual private companies having to answer these kinds of questions for their lenders. Listen, I've already talked a little bit longer than I intended. I want to open the floor for questions. Anybody has a question, you type it into the chat, or you may be able to turn on your video and audio and ask the question there. I'm going to ask one while people imagine what they want to ask you about emissions. I'm going to detour for just a second, Kevin, and ask, tell me about oil markets. I know it's not your thing anymore. BP's annual review of energy came out recently, their energy outlook, and they talk about the possibility of oil being at its plateau now and then declining. What are your thoughts on the market for oil demand, or the outlook for oil demand, and how that affects oil price? Recognizing it's a little off topic.
Yeah, when I think about the oil market, we see a fracturing, or the oil market as we know just doesn't exist anymore, right? We're talking about differentiated pricing around emissions, but we are seeing differentiated pricing around origin from as Europe tries to displace the Russian crude, the Russian gas, the Russian diesel, and other commodities as well. A lot about the oil price. There's a lot of discussion around peak oil demand. A lot of people have called it, and it continues to grow strongly, or the demand continues to be robust. We continue to see travel increase in Asia as well, which will put demand upwards as well. One thing I always say is everybody wants to talk about oil plateau and oil peaking. The oil market is massive. And, I think there's plenty of space to be carved out, even in a declining scenario, for a lot of E&P. And again, because these wells and these productions going to decline naturally from the depletion of the reservoirs, we're going to have an E&P sector for a long time, drilling and completing and bringing on new supply. And if we want to manage that emissions as well, drilling can be part of that emission management from a carbon intensity point of view as well.
Interesting. Retire stuff early and bring on new drilling. That's a totally new thought for me. I think people have misunderstood, people outside the industry misunderstood the imperative to move away from oil and gas. Even the net zero trajectories brought forward by IEA and BP and others still require oil. Even the scenarios that involve no new exploration still involve production, and they involve doing that redevelopment, continued developing existing fields up through 2050, such that we're still producing, using in that best case scenario, best for the environment, 25 million barrels of oil per day 30 years from now. So it's about a 5% annual decline that they're calling for, which is a far cry from what people have thought it is. What has worried me is the uncertainty in how things are moving. That in the near term, it could be really rocky to keep supply and demand balanced when there are so many changes going on at a low level.
Yeah, a lot of the supply side, I'd say, has moved to be more inelastic, which is kind of interesting, which sets yourself up for more volatility. Shale was seen as the great responder, right? But fiscal discipline, which has permeated the North American system, has made it less flexible than one would expect, as they sought to optimize value over volume. And so you see the market having a lot of demand variables associated with instabilities in parts of the world, but the ability to respond from a supply side has become more inelastic, I would say.
That's probably not that's probably good news for volatility. Bad news for other things, but if you like volatility. So Marshall was asking about the different components that are typically included in an emission profile, and I think I understand his question. Would you just reiterate, Kevin, the sort of range of things? So emissions at the wellhead, scope 1, scope 2. We can't do anything about scope 3.
Yeah, there's many different ways to answer that question. There's certainly different emission scopes. So scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and then emission scopes are around the emissions associated with a specific asset or physical thing, right? So if I had a refinery and I put a fence around the refinery, you and I could point at it and go, "There's a refinery," and you say, "Hey, there's scope 1 emissions they've got some boilers. I can see them." That's their scope 1 emissions. It's inside their plant gate fence, right? And you've got scope 2 emissions, which are that facility, that refiner may be plugged into the grid and pulling some stuff off the power plant. So scope 2 would be like, well, no, wait, we have to include that in your profile too. You can't, because you can see the refiner going, I'm just going to put everything outside my fence and my scope 1 is going to go to 0 and I'm going to be awesome. Like everybody's like, no, 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 no. Scope 2 is like, no, bring that in. You got to account for that. Scope 3 is the value chain, right? So you can think about that refiner sitting there down in Corpus or something. All the crude oil that flows to that refinery, natural gas, was produced somewhere else. The gas was gas processed, it transported, all that emissions becomes part of that scope 3. And then everything that comes out of that refinery and is sold to market and transported to market is part of scope 3. And so that's your 1, 2, and 3. Another way to think about emissions, not to confuse this even further, is life cycle emissions. And so if
Please.
you throw out the concept of a physical asset with a fence and you go, now we're talking about a physical product, a Coke can, a barrel of oil, a cargo of LNG, whatever. What's the carbon intensity of that LNG? So it's not about a physical asset anymore. It's about the product. So what was put into the extraction of that? You had to clear the land. You had to drill and complete. You had to produce that gas. You had to process that gas through a gas plant. You had to transport it to the LNG facility. You had to liquefy it. You had to put it in the vessel. You had to transport it. Let's say it's going to Rotterdam, goes to Rotterdam, and then you burn it. What's the carbon intensity of that process, that value chain? So it's a slightly different thing because we're not drawing a fence around a specific location. We're saying, what's the intensity of that product?
Well, I suppose there's one other way to look at it, and that would be, if I build this asset, what's its emission intensity over the 30 years of its operational life? So I've thought that the oil and gas industry really needed a scope 2.5. Everything we have control of, but not including combustion. Because so much of our product is burned, right? It burns great. But that burning piece is by far the largest part of scope 3 emissions.
Uh-huh.
But beyond scope 2 is things like all the trucks that come to my location to pick up my oil to take it to market, and all of the contractors who come onto location to do operational, to drill, the contractors who come on location to frack. So it seems like we ought to have some sort of measure that includes the things we have control over, but not scope 3.
That's similar to scope 1 and 2. I think the confusion around scope comes down to people trying to assign responsibility and blame, right? And certainly I would argue that scope 1, it's within your control. Even scope 2 is within your control as an asset owner, right? You've made choices about what you built, how you operate it, and all that stuff. But there's also like the fact that we still need refineries, right? We still drive cars, so that we still have to deal with the reality that we use and demand these fuels every day to enjoy the quality of life we have. But to go back to the scope thing, I think there's value in understanding scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. But it's when we go from over the line and try to assign responsibility, like the scope 3, and I've seen this many, many times, scope 3 trying to be assigned to upstream operators, that this is your responsibility. What are you doing about it? That's interesting I don't think I'd ever blame Shell for the fact I bought a vehicle that has a combustion engine and I drive it probably not at the optimal, most efficient speed, which would be like, I'm in Canada, so 80 kilometers an hour, 40 miles an hour or something like that. I don't drive it that way. So it's Shell's fault for all these choices I've made. I do think there's value in understanding that, because scope 1, 2, and 3 is about understanding risk and exposure. And so there's value in understanding who's leveraged to a high intensity hydrocarbon value chain. That's interesting to know how companies look relative to each other. But to assign the blame, I don't know if we'll get anywhere. I don't know if that solves my choice.
Well, listen, this was an article I published just recently. It posed the question, oil and gas, villain, victim, or hero. And there's some truth in the industry historically has done some things counterproductively. It's true that I sure am glad I can drive my car and keep my house warm. And it's also true that a lot of us are suffering pressures of problems that we weren't really aware we needed to deal with. But all three of those roles are the corners of the Cartman drama triangle. And this is a term from psychology. All three of them are counterproductive roles that people take on. It's not healthy to be a villain or a victim or a hero. They're all too black and white, and blame really doesn't help us. What we really need is to solve problems.
Yep.
The good news is we're smart. We have capital. We have assets, and I think we can. I think we can do this. Well, not hearing any other questions. Is there anything that we didn't talk about, Kevin, that you think we ought to know about emissions and how to address them?
No, I think we touched on a lot of things. I think what we're seeing is our understanding of these issues is increasing rapidly. And through that understanding, I think we will see improvements, and we are seeing improvements. And I do think one thing to consider is we do see a long life here for the upstream space. It's not something that's going to fade away tomorrow. It has a long enduring need. And that need is, frankly, to meet you and I driving habits, but other things as well. And we're being a little bit facetious, but
Yeah.
the consequences, if we can't meet those needs, are very severe. Like if we collectively agree we need to reduce our emissions and improve our environmental performance, doing so requires society that gets along to some degree.
Yeah.
And if we can't meet those basic needs of affordable energy, that political will that needs to be there will quickly evaporate, and we'll have policy instability. And so we will lose significant amounts of time required for us to actually get on with doing practical things on energy transition. So there is a critical balance between and the need for upstream oil and gas today, and probably for a long time too. And then I think that sector is going to compete like mad on emissions and emission intensity.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, last question then. What way would you suggest that people keep up with? What would they follow, read, watch to keep up with what's going on, and how to participate?
Well, of course, you follow S&P News.
There you go.
There you go.
I listen. I love what you guys put out. Thank you. I appreciate it so much, Kevin. Pleasure to talk with you. We'll get this posted on the platform, and I look forward to talking again.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here.
Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.
Oh,
Hey
for
guys,
those of
if y'all
you,
could just stay on for a second.
sure.
Cool. Go ahead, Dwayne.
I was going to say, I was going to tell people to go over to the next round of presentations. Will start in about 10 minutes, to head over to the agenda to find the presentations. But I think I missed my opportunity.
No, I think that's it. Great.
All right.